Sometimes the smallest decisions carry the weight of entire futures. A man stands at a livestock auction on a dusty Texas afternoon in 1889, his pockets nearly empty, his ranch barely surviving another season. Around him, buyers bid on prime cattle and strong horses, investments that promise returns. But his eyes fall on something everyone else has dismissed, a skeletal horse, ribs visible through matted coat, standing in a corner lot marked for clearance. The auctioneer barely bothers announcing it, certain no one will waste money on such obvious failure. Yet this man raises his hand for a bid so small it's almost insulting. 5 cents. 1 nickel that changes everything. What he discovers in the weeks that follow will test not just his survival instincts, but his willingness to see value where others see only loss. This is the story of a man who had nothing to lose and a horse that had everything to prove. It's a story about redemption, wearing 4 hooves, and the extraordinary power of second chances. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The rain had turned Clearwater Valley's main street into a river of red mud that reflected nothing but desperation. Marcus Webb stood outside the bank building, his weathered hands gripping the edge of his worn hat, staring at the notice pinned to the door. 90 days. That's all the bank was giving him. 90 days to pay the back taxes on the Webb family ranch or watch it go to auction. The paper trembled slightly, though there was no wind, just the shake in his hands that came from knowing you'd run out of options. He was 37 years old, had spent every one of those years in Texas ranching country, following his father into a life built on land and livestock and the belief that hard work eventually paid dividends. His father had believed that right up until the drought of 1,885 killed half the herd and stripped the topsoil clean. By the time rain came back, the damage was done. The ranch had limped along for 4 years since, barely producing enough to cover operating costs, let alone the taxes that seemed to multiply each season like locusts. Marcus had tried everything a reasonable man tried. He'd expanded his herd with borrowed money, hoping volume would compensate for diminished quality. That had failed when disease swept through the newly purchased cattle, killing more animals than it spared. He'd attempted to lease grazing rights on neighboring property, a practice that worked for some ranchers, but for him had only created conflict with men who resented an outsider's presence on their land. He'd even considered selling off parcels of the family ranch, but every buyer who came to look at the property took one ride across the deteriorating grassland and politely declined. The Webb Ranch had become something close to cursed in the eyes of Clearwater Valley, not because of anything Marcus had done wrong. The drought and disease were acts of nature, not negligence, but because perception and reputation often mattered more than facts in small communities. People who'd known his father, respected him even, treated Marcus with a politeness that barely concealed pity. They saw a man who didn't have his father's luck, who lacked the instinct for survival that ranching demanded. His sister Catherine lived in San Antonio now, married to a merchant, comfortable in a way Marcus would never be. She'd offered to help financially, offered more than once, but accepting money from her would feel like admitting final defeat. The ranch was supposed to be his legacy, his way of honoring the years his father had invested. Losing it to a bank auction would mean that legacy had been nothing but borrowed time. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, and Marcus decided he needed a drink, not to celebrate, there was nothing to celebrate, but to sit in a familiar place with familiar people and pretend for an hour that the world wasn't collapsing around him. The Maverick Saloon occupied the corner building at the end of Clearwater's main street, a structure that had existed longer than most of the buildings surrounding it, weathered into something between solid and permanent. Inside, the air was thick with tobacco smoke and the smell of whiskey that had soaked into the wooden floorboards over decades. A few men played cards in the corner, their conversation low and focused on the game. The bartender, a broad-shouldered man named Hector, who'd been pouring drinks here for longer than Marcus could remember, looked up as he entered. "Marcus," Hector said, already reaching for the bottle of rye Marcus typically ordered. "Rough day?" Marcus settled onto a stool and didn't answer immediately. Hector set the drink down anyway, knowing sometimes silence was the only honest response. The whiskey burned on its way down, and Marcus let it sit in his stomach, feeling the familiar warmth that came close to numbness if you drank enough of it. "Banks taking the ranch," Marcus finally said. The words came out flat, like he was reporting weather rather than the dissolution of his life. Hector's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted, a settling that suggested he'd expected this news for some time. He'd probably known, Marcus realized. Most people probably had. Small towns, being what they were, with gossip traveling faster than information, everyone likely knew about the tax notices before Marcus had even opened them. "You got family to go to?" Hector asked, not unkindly. "My sisters offered to take me in," Marcus said. "But that's not what I came here to do." He paused, drinking more of the whiskey. "My father built that ranch from nothing but stubbornness and belief. Took him 20 years to make it viable. I've had it for 12, and managed to run it into the ground like I was deliberately trying to destroy it." Hector leaned against the bar, his massive frame somehow conveying sympathy without words. "You got hit with circumstances no man could have controlled. Drought doesn't care about your intentions. Disease doesn't respect hard work." "Maybe not," Marcus acknowledged. "But other ranchers weathered the same drought. Other people's herds survived the disease. There's a difference between bad luck and bad management, and I'm starting to think I'm guilty of both." One of the card players called for another round, and Hector excused himself to pour drinks. Marcus sat with his own glass, watching the liquid amber catch the light from the windows. Outside, he could hear the sounds of the town going about its business. A wagon rolled past, pulled by healthy horses. Someone shouted a greeting to someone else. Life continuing around him, while his own existence contracted into this narrow moment of sitting in a dim bar, waiting for time to pass. He'd gone through his money carefully over the past 4 years. There wasn't much to go through. His father had left the ranch in better condition than his finances. Marcus had used what savings existed to keep the property maintained, to attempt various recovery strategies. He'd hired hands when he could afford them, let them go when he couldn't. He'd fixed fences himself to save on labor costs. He'd learned basic veterinary care to treat sick animals without calling an expensive doctor. Everything had been targeted toward preservation, and nothing had worked. What remained in his pocket was approximately $14.32. $14.32 stood between him and complete dependency on his sister's charity. It wasn't quite enough for a train ticket to San Antonio, though he could get close. It was definitely enough to drink himself into unconsciousness if he wanted to make that choice. Instead, Marcus finished his whiskey and ordered another, because he wasn't ready to leave the saloon and face the reality waiting outside. Here, in the familiar dimness of the Maverick, he could pretend he was just a man having a drink in the middle of an ordinary day. Out there, he was the man who'd failed to hold on to what his father had built. Hector returned and set down the second drink. "You know," he said, his voice taking on the tone of someone sharing something he'd been considering, "there's an auction tomorrow. The territorial livestock sales out at Garrison's Field. Lot of ranchers will be there, looking to buy and sell. Might be worth going, seeing what opportunities present themselves." Marcus looked at Hector with the expression of someone who'd been offered advice about opportunities from a man who'd spent his life pouring drinks. "With what money?" "I've got $14, Hector. That won't buy anything worth buying." "Maybe not," Hector conceded. "But sometimes value isn't about price. Sometimes it's about seeing what others miss." It was the kind of vague wisdom that people offered when they didn't actually know what to say but felt compelled to offer something. Marcus thanked him anyway, because Hector meant well. and there was something noble about a man trying to offer hope, even when hope had clearly become a finite resource. That night, Marcus rode out to the ranch for what might be among the final times. The house was dark, all the hands having been let go weeks earlier when he couldn't justify the expense. He'd been managing alone, doing the work of 4 men, because he couldn't afford to hire even one. The cabin was cold despite the Texas heat outside, carrying the particular chill of a space no longer being lived in with full presence. He sat on the porch in the darkness, looking out at the landscape his father had claimed and transformed. Even in the dark, he could map it mentally. The creek that ran through the eastern section, the grazing land that stretched toward the ridge, the barn where he'd learned to break horses as a boy. Watching his father demonstrate patience that seemed almost supernatural. His father had a gift for animals that Marcus had never quite inherited. Daniel Webb could look at a horse and see something in it that others missed. He'd once purchased a scarred stallion that every other rancher had deemed unfit for work, and through months of careful training, had transformed it into a reliable breeding animal that had improved the whole herd's bloodline. "You have to see past what's broken," his father used to say. "See what it could become if given the chance." Marcus had tried to apply that philosophy to ranching in general, but philosophy didn't pay taxes or restore depleted grassland. Philosophy was a luxury for men with security. The next morning, despite his own cynicism about Hector's suggestion, Marcus found himself riding toward Garrison's field. He told himself it was just to get out of the house, to avoid sitting with his thoughts for another day. But truthfully, he had nowhere else to be, and maybe watching other men engage in successful transactions would be better than staring at the walls of his dying ranch. Garrison's field was a sprawling property about 8 miles outside Clearwater, maintained by the territorial government as a neutral space for livestock auctions and sales. When Marcus arrived, the grounds were already crowded with ranchers, farmers, traders, and various people whose relationship to livestock was purely commercial. Corrals had been set up holding cattle, horses, sheep, and other animals. An auctioneer was already moving through the first lot, his voice carrying across the field in the practiced cadence of someone who'd done this work 1,000 times. Marcus wandered through the sale grounds, watching transactions happen, noting prices, and trying to understand the logic of what was being paid for what. Healthy cattle brought good money. Young horses in decent condition moved quickly. Even older animals with some years of work left in them found buyers willing to invest. It was near the end of the day, when most of the crowd had thinned because the remaining lots were considered less desirable, that Marcus noticed the final corral. In it stood a horse that looked like it had been assembled by someone who described a horse to a sculptor who'd never actually seen one. The animal was skeletal, its coat matted and dull, its ribs visible as clear definition under what remained of its hide. It was brown, or had been brown once, though now it was more the color of dust and neglect. The auctioneer, a man named Pritchard who'd been conducting the sales all day with relentless energy, looked almost apologetic as he approached this lot. "Final sale of the day," he announced, his voice carrying less enthusiasm than it had for previous animals. "This animal came in from the Barker estate liquidation, not in premium condition, as you can see, but potentially viable with proper rehabilitation." No one moved, no hands went up. The crowd had largely dispersed, and those remaining were waiting only to confirm that the final lots weren't worth their time. "Do I have an opening bid?" Pritchard asked. $5 to start? Nothing. $2? Still nothing. The horse stood in the corral, seemingly indifferent to its own potential sale. It didn't move much, just swayed slightly, as if standing itself was an effort that required significant concentration. $1? Pritchard tried, his professional optimism clearly straining. Still no response. Marcus watched this strange moment, this horse that no one wanted, this animal that appeared to have value to literally no one in this field full of people making calculated decisions about livestock. Without consciously deciding to do it, Marcus raised his hand. 50 cents, he said. Pritchard actually looked surprised, as if someone bidding on the horse at any price was unexpected enough to warrant genuine reaction. 50 cents? Going once. Marcus kept his hand raised, not sure why, not sure what he intended to do with an animal that looked like it might expire from the effort of transportation. Going twice. Sold. To the gentleman in the grey hat for 50 cents. It was only after Pritchard had recorded the sale that Marcus realized he'd just spent half of his last dollar on a horse that appeared to be actively dying. The other ranchers around him were actually smiling, not unkindly, but with the particular amusement that comes from watching someone make a decision that seemed obviously foolish. "You planning to give it a mercy killing?" one of them asked. "Haven't decided yet," Marcus replied, which was honest. He had no idea what he was planning to do with this animal. He had no idea what had possessed him to bid at all. The paperwork was completed, and the skeletal horse was led from the corral. Marcus paid his 50 cents and accepted the lead rope, suddenly the owner of an animal that looked like it might not survive the ride back to town. It was at that moment that an older man, Marcus, recognized vaguely, a rancher named Thomas Harlow, who'd operated successfully in the area for decades, approached him. "That was either the bravest thing I've seen in years, or the foolishest," Harlow said, studying the horse with an expression Marcus couldn't quite read. "Maybe both. That animal's got something in its eyes, though, something most animals don't have when they've been that neglected. Curiosity, maybe. Or stubbornness. I'm not sure what I was thinking," Marcus admitted. Harlow studied Marcus more carefully. "You're Daniel Webb's boy, aren't you? The one trying to keep the family ranch going?" "Trying being the operative word," Marcus said. "Not succeeding." Harlow nodded, as if this confirmed something he'd already known. "Your father was a good man, good with animals, had an eye for potential. You might have inherited that, whether you know it or not." He paused, then added, "That horse cost you 50 cents. It's worth at least that much in terms of figuring out what it actually is, underneath all that neglect. Give it a month. See what happens." Harlow walked away before Marcus could respond, leaving him standing in the Texas dust with a lead rope attached to a horse that seemed to barely register its own existence. The ride back to the ranch took longer than Marcus anticipated because the horse moved slowly, conserving energy with the deliberation of an animal that understood motion cost more than it could currently afford. Several times Marcus wondered if the creature would actually make it all the way, or if he'd end up walking it part of the distance. But it did make it, barely and slowly, and with what seemed like genuine relief when they finally reached the ranch property and Marcus led it to the barn. He had feed stored, not much, because he'd sold most of his supplies weeks earlier, but enough to sustain a horse for a while. He gave the animal water and a portion of oats, then stood back to watch it eat, with a caution that suggested it wasn't entirely sure food was meant to be trusted. That night, lying in his bed in the darkened cabin, Marcus kept thinking about what Harlow had said. Give it a month, see what happens. It was ridiculous advice. The horse was probably going to die anyway. Diseases that went this deep into an animal didn't necessarily resolve just because you offered it food and shelter. And even if the horse survived, recovered, became functional, what then? Marcus would still lose the ranch. He'd still be going to San Antonio to live off his sister's generosity. But the suggestion had planted something in his mind, a small seed of the kind of curiosity that came with seeing potential where others saw only loss. His father had operated from that same impulse, had believed that transformation was possible if you were willing to invest the time and attention required to facilitate it. Marcus had $14. He now had a horse that cost 50 cents. What he didn't have was certainty about anything else. But tomorrow he would feed that horse again, and the day after that he would feed it again, and in doing so he would honor the philosophy his father had tried to teach him about seeing past what was broken to what could be rebuilt. It wasn't a plan. It wasn't even particularly rational. But it was something, and something Marcus was learning might be enough to build on. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The first week with the horse was a study in patience that Marcus wasn't entirely sure he possessed. He'd named the animal Redemption, partly because he needed something to call it beyond the skeletal horse, and partly because the name seemed to capture something of what he was attempting, not just rehabilitating an animal, but maybe rehabilitating himself in the process. Though he kept that reasoning private, aware that speaking it aloud would make it sound even more foolish than it already was. Every morning, Marcus would wake before dawn and make his way to the barn, uncertain what condition he'd find Redemption in. The first few days, he half expected to discover the horse had died in the night, that its body simply couldn't sustain consciousness given how far it had deteriorated. But each morning, Redemption was standing, alert in a way that surprised Marcus. Despite the skeletal frame and the evident exhaustion, the horse's eyes tracked Marcus's movements with intelligence and what seemed like genuine interest. The second day, Redemption actually nickered when Marcus approached a small sound, barely more than a breath, but a sound that suggested recognition or at least acknowledgement of his presence. It was such a small thing, barely worth noting, yet it lodged in Marcus's mind as meaningful. This horse had been neglected enough that it had nearly ceased to exist as a living creature, and yet it still possessed the capacity to greet another being with something like awareness. Marcus began working on a routine. He'd arrive at the barn with fresh water and feed, entering the stall slowly, never making sudden movements. The horse's ribs were so pronounced that Marcus could count them visually, could see each one like the frames of a building not yet covered. He started grooming Redemption carefully, using a soft brush on the matted coat, working out tangles and debris that had accumulated. The horse would stand for this, sometimes closing its eyes, as if receiving the grooming was a sensory experience so foreign it required concentration to process. On the third day, Marcus attempted to assess the horse's hooves, something he'd been hesitant to do, aware that neglected animals often developed serious hoof problems. When he lifted the first hoof, Redemption tensed but didn't pull away. The hoof was in terrible condition, cracked, overgrown, infected in places. Marcus cleaned what he could, working carefully to remove debris without causing further damage. He would need to call in a farrier eventually, but that required money he didn't currently possess. By the end of the first week, the most noticeable change wasn't physical, but behavioral. Redemption began to move with slightly more energy. The horse still wasn't what anyone would call healthy, but the exhaustion that had characterized every motion seemed slightly less profound. The animal started to graze in the paddock for short periods, instead of simply standing in place, and Marcus began to understand that the horse's passivity hadn't been acceptance of death so much as conservation of resources, survival strategy adapted to a life of deprivation. It was on the 8th day that Marcus received an unexpected visitor. Thomas Harlow rode up to the ranch in the late afternoon, his horse moving with the confidence of an animal well-trained and well-maintained. Marcus was in the paddock with Redemption, watching the horse pick at grass with careful deliberation when Harlow dismounted and approached the fence. "Thought I'd check on your investment," Harlow said, his tone carrying amusement but not mockery. He approached the paddock and studied Redemption carefully, the way his eyes moved over the horse's frame, suggesting he was assessing something beyond what was immediately visible. "It's still alive," Marcus said, "which I suppose exceeds expectations." Harlow nodded slowly. "More than that. Look at its stance. Look at how it's standing now versus how it would have been standing last week. The tension's gone from its shoulders. The anxiety in its posture is diminishing." He paused, continuing to observe. "This horse isn't just surviving, Marcus. It's beginning to believe it might actually survive. That's a different thing entirely." Marcus had noticed the changes, had registered them on some level, but hearing someone else articulate them made them feel more real, more significant. He'd been so focused on the practical aspects of care that he hadn't stepped back to assess the larger transformation occurring. "How long do you think it will take," Marcus asked, "for the horse to be functional, I mean, to be worth something?" Harlow was quiet for a moment. "That depends on what's underneath all that neglect. Some horses, once they're broken down that far, they don't recover." "Not really. The damage goes too deep, becomes part of what they are. But this one," he gestured toward Redemption, "this one's got something. The way it watches you, the way it's already responding to basic care. It wants to live, Marcus. That makes all the difference." Harlow stayed for another hour, and during that time he shared something of his own history. Years earlier, he'd purchased a horse under similar circumstances, not at auction, but from a neighbor who was ready to shoot the animal, rather than spend more resources keeping it alive. Harlow had insisted on taking it, had spent months rehabilitating it, and that horse had eventually become the foundation of a breeding line that had strengthened his entire operation. "The thing people don't understand about horses," Harlow explained, "is that they're incredibly responsive to being seen. Most animals are. You neglect them long enough, and they start to believe they're not worth attention. But the moment someone starts investing in them, treating them as if they have value, they begin to shift their own sense of what's possible. It's not magic. It's just that living creatures need to feel like their existence matters." After Harlow left, Marcus sat with that observation. He'd been thinking about the horse almost exclusively in practical terms: calories required, water consumed, incremental improvements in condition. But Harlow's words suggested something deeper was happening, a psychological transformation occurring, alongside the physical rehabilitation. The second week brought more visible changes. Redemption's coat began to show glimmers of its actual color underneath the accumulated grime. Where the matted sections had been groomed, new hair was growing in, and the underlying brown was richer than Marcus had initially realized. The horse began to move more freely in the paddock, starting to trot short distances, then longer ones. The limp that had characterized its initial movements began to smooth out. More significantly, Redemption started to interact with Marcus in new ways. The horse would approach him when he entered the paddock, rather than waiting passively for care to be administered. It would follow Marcus from one area to another. On the 14th day, when Marcus was working on fence repairs, Redemption stood nearby, watching his movements with what seemed like genuine curiosity. When Marcus spoke to the horse, explaining what he was doing, Redemption's ears tracked the sound of his voice, responding to the cadence even if the words held no literal meaning. It was during this second week that Marcus's financial situation became suddenly urgent. A letter arrived from the bank, hand-delivered by a man who seemed uncomfortable with the task. The 90 days had been reduced to 60 due to administrative changes and increased pressure from territorial auditors. Marcus had approximately 4 weeks left before the property would be auctioned. He sat on the porch reading the letter twice, trying to find some alternative interpretation that didn't exist. 4 weeks. He'd spent 2 weeks rehabilitating a horse that was still not even remotely close to being marketable. Even if Redemption made a complete recovery, horses required months or years to demonstrate genuine value. He was running out of time. The temptation was strong to simply stop feeding the horse, to cut his losses and focus on trying to figure out what to do with his remaining resources. But each time he considered it, he found himself unable to follow through. Redemption had begun to trust him, had begun to believe in the possibility of survival. Withdrawing that support felt like a betrayal more profound than simply failing at ranching. Instead, Marcus made a decision that was arguably irrational. He used 5 of his remaining dollars to purchase additional feed and supplements from the general store. The proprietor, a man named Calvin who'd known Marcus's father, seemed surprised by the purchase. "Thought you were closing up," Calvin said, ringing up the transaction. "I'm trying something," Marcus replied, not offering details. "That horse you bought at auction?" Calvin asked. his tone suggesting he'd heard about the purchase. Word traveled fast in small towns. Yes, Calvin nodded slowly. Your father would do something like this, not because it made financial sense, but because it felt true. I remember he once spent weeks rehabilitating a mule that everyone else considered worthless. That mule ended up being the most reliable animal in his operation. He paused, entering the final amount. I don't know if that matters to you, but I thought you should know. Marcus took the supplies and headed back to the ranch, the knowledge that his father had operated from similar instincts, providing some measure of validation. Even if this didn't work out, even if he lost everything, at least he'd be making decisions based on his own values rather than on fear. The third week brought a development Marcus hadn't expected. One morning, as he was working on repairs to the barn roof, a woman rode up to the property. She was perhaps 40, dressed practically in riding clothes, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. She introduced herself as Margaret Ashford, saying that Thomas Harlow had mentioned Marcus's horse and that she'd wanted to see it herself. Margaret was a breeder from the next county over, she explained, someone who worked with horses, specifically buying neglected animals, rehabilitating them, and either selling them on or incorporating them into breeding programs. She spent an hour with Redemption, moving around the animal, assessing its frame and condition with the eye of someone who'd done this many times before. Interesting, she said finally, her expression thoughtful. This horse has good bones underneath all the damage. The conformation is sound. If you can continue the rehabilitation, there's potential here. She turned to Marcus. Why did you buy it? The question seemed simple, but Marcus found himself struggling to answer it honestly. I had $14 to my name and 50 cents to spare, he said finally, and the horse needed someone to believe it had value. Margaret smiled slightly. That's not why most people make decisions about animals. That's not how most people operate at all. But that's the only way genuine transformation happens. She paused. How much longer can you keep feeding it? About 3 weeks, Marcus said, the words carrying the weight of his deadline. Margaret nodded, understanding the implication immediately. Would you be willing to let me take the horse for 3 months? Not to buy it yet, but to continue the rehabilitation at my facility. I'd cover all costs. At the end of that period, we'd reassess the horse's condition and determine its value. If it's recovered, as well as I suspect it might, there could be significant money in it. Marcus stared at her, uncertain if he was hearing the offer correctly. You'd do that? I would, Margaret confirmed. Not as charity. As investment. If this horse becomes what I think it might become, it's worth my time and resources. And you clearly understand something about seeing potential that most people have forgotten. It took Marcus only moments to decide. Redemption would be cared for by someone who understood horses in ways he was only beginning to learn. The animal would have 3 months to continue its recovery without the pressure of Marcus's financial desperation. And at the end of that time, there was the possibility of actual value emerging from the decision to spend 50 cents on a horse no one wanted. Yes, Marcus said. Yes, I'll agree to that. The transaction was arranged verbally, Margaret's word apparently being valuable enough to serve as contract in this community. She arranged for someone to transport Redemption the following day, and as Marcus watched the horse being loaded into a trailer, he felt something he hadn't experienced in weeks. Not hope exactly, but something close to it. The possibility that not every decision he'd made had been wrong, that maybe his father's instincts for seeing potential ran deeper in his blood than Marcus had believed. That night, Marcus sat on the porch of his soon-to-be former ranch and thought about the strange sequence of events that had led him to this moment. A failed rancher with $14, a horse that cost 50 cents, and a woman who believed in seeing beyond what was immediately visible. It wasn't a plan, it wasn't security, but it was something, and something, Marcus was learning, might be enough. The 3 weeks following Redemption's departure felt longer than the preceding month. Marcus found himself with a ranch that was no longer his responsibility in any meaningful sense. The cattle had been sold weeks earlier, the hands had moved on to other employment, and now even the one creature that had given him purpose was gone. He should have felt relieved, unburdened. Instead, he felt untethered, floating in a space between his old life and whatever came next. The bank's final notice arrived on a Monday, delivered by the same uncomfortable messenger as before. The auction was scheduled for exactly 3 weeks from that date. Marcus read the document with the detachment of someone who'd already accepted the inevitable. His family home, the land his father had built from nothing, the history of 2 generations, all of it would be offered to the highest bidder. Unless something extraordinary happened, that bidder would likely be a speculator or larger ranching operation looking to consolidate property. He spent that week dealing with practical matters. He contacted Catherine in San Antonio and accepted her offer of temporary lodging while he figured out his next steps. He notified the bank that he would not be making a counterbid at the auction. He began the process of sorting through the possessions that had accumulated over his lifetime, deciding what would be worth transporting, what would be left behind, what should be sold for whatever pittance it might bring. It was during this sorting that Marcus discovered his father's journals stacked in a wooden chest in the bedroom that had been his father's. There were 23 of them, leather-bound volumes filled with his father's handwriting, documenting decisions made and animals purchased and observations about the Topeka, ranching life over the course of 30 years. Marcus sat on the bed and opened the oldest one, dated 1859, and began to read. The early entries were about establishing the ranch, about surveying land and building structures, and learning through experimentation which practices worked in Texas ranching conditions. But interspersed throughout were personal observations, reflections on failure and success, notes about animals that had surprised him with their resilience or disappointed him with their fragility, thoughts about what it meant to build something lasting in a landscape that seemed designed to defeat human ambition. One entry, dated 1872, stood out. Marcus's father had written about purchasing a scarred stallion that another rancher was planning to shoot. The entry described the animal's condition in detail, the reasons everyone else considered it worthless, and his own instinct that something valuable existed underneath the damage. He'd spent months rehabilitating the horse, and the entry concluded, "People see what an animal looks like and make conclusions about what it can become. But appearance is temporary. Character is durable. This horse has character. That's worth the investment of time." Marcus read that entry 3 times, feeling the weight of inherited philosophy more profoundly than he'd expected. His father's approach to ranching hadn't been primarily about economics or efficiency. It had been about seeing potential and having the patience to cultivate it. That philosophy had built the family ranch during decades when economics would have suggested giving up. And that same philosophy was what had driven Marcus to purchase redemption for 50 cents. He carried the journals with him when he finally closed up the house and prepared to leave Clearwater Valley. They felt like his inheritance now, not land or cattle or buildings, but the accumulated wisdom of a man who'd understood that value often required vision to recognize. During the week of redemption's absence, Margaret Ashford sent a letter. It was brief, but the content stopped Marcus's breath when he read it. The horse was responding remarkably well to rehabilitation. Its condition was improving faster than Margaret had anticipated. There had been a development that warranted discussion, but Margaret preferred to discuss it in person rather than through written correspondence. She invited Marcus to visit her facility the following weekend. Marcus made the ride to Margaret's property on Saturday morning, leaving before dawn to ensure he arrived at a reasonable hour. The journey took him through landscape he'd spent his entire life viewing, but experiencing it differently now, not as a rancher assessing grazing potential and water sources, but as a man traveling through country that was no longer his. Margaret's operation was significantly larger than Marcus had anticipated. The property encompassed several hundred acres of well-maintained pasture, multiple barns, corrals, and other structures that spoke to a serious breeding and training enterprise. Margaret herself met him near the main barn, her expression carrying something between excitement and caution. "Thank you for coming," she said, her grip firm as she shook his hand. "I wanted to show you something before I explained it." She led him toward a paddock where several horses were grazing, and immediately Marcus's eyes found redemption. The transformation was staggering. The skeletal frame had filled out considerably. The coat, now properly groomed and cared for, revealed the rich chestnut brown that had been hidden under neglect. The horse moved with fluidity that suggested strength returning to muscles that had atrophied. But more than the physical changes, there was something in the animals bearing a confidence, almost an arrogance, that suggested redemption was remembering what it meant to feel capable. "This is remarkable," Marcus breathed, unable to take his eyes off the poor horse. "It is," Margaret agreed, "but here's what's truly remarkable. 3 days ago, I had a potential buyer visit the property, a man named Harrison from Austin, looking for breeding stock. He saw redemption in the paddock and asked about it." She paused, and Marcus felt his heart rate accelerate with the understanding that this story was moving towards something significant. He wanted to know its history, its breeding, why it was being rehabilitated. "I told him what little I knew, that it was purchased from auction in terrible condition, that you'd recognize potential in it, and invested the time to begin rehabilitation. He asked me directly what I thought the horse would be worth fully recovered." Margaret turned to face Marcus directly. "I told him I estimated $800 to $1,200, depending on how completely it recovers and what its performance demonstrates during training." Marcus felt the number like a physical blow. $1,200. It was more money than he'd ever possessed. At one time in his life, it was enough to pay his back taxes. It was enough to negotiate with the bank, to buy time, to potentially save the ranch. "Did he make an offer?" Marcus asked, his voice emerging as barely more than a whisper. "He did," Margaret confirmed. "He offered $800 for the horse right now, without waiting for complete recovery. He said even in its current condition, once it's fully trained, it will be worth significantly more. But Marcus, I told him I needed to speak with you before making any decisions." They walked to a bench near the barn and sat, and Margaret explained the situation in detail. The man from Austin was a serious buyer, someone with the resources and knowledge to properly evaluate horsehesh. He was willing to put his money where his assessment was, offering $800 for an animal that was demonstrably still in recovery. That valuation was based on what the horse already showed and what he projected it could become. "I'm telling you this," Margaret continued, "because this horse is your redemption as much as it's the horse's redemption. You made a choice that no one else would have made, based on seeing something others missed. That choice is about to change your life. The question is, what you do with that knowledge." "What do you mean?" Marcus asked. "I mean," Margaret said carefully, "that you could accept the $800 right now, use it to address your immediate crisis, save your ranch if that's possible, and move forward. That would be a rational decision." "But," Marcus prompted, hearing the unspoken alternative in her tone. "But," Margaret continued, "you could wait. Give me another 3 months to continue the rehabilitation. Let the horse be fully trained and demonstrated. At that point, the buyer has indicated he'd be willing to pay significantly more, potentially $1,500 to $2,000. The risk is that something could go wrong, the horse could become injured, could develop unseen problems. The reward is significantly greater financial security." She paused, letting the choice settle into the space between them. "I can't make this decision for you," Margaret said. "It's your horse, your choice, but I wanted you to understand what's actually possible here. This isn't just about money, Marcus. It's about understanding that your instincts were right, that seeing potential where others see only loss is a valuable skill. That patience and belief can transform circumstances. Marcus sat with this information for a long time, unable to immediately respond. The ranch existed in his mind. The possibility of saving it was suddenly tangible in a way it hadn't been since the bank's initial notice. But Margaret's suggestion was to risk that certainty for a greater potential return. "If I wait," Marcus said slowly, "and something happens to the horse, if it gets injured or sick, then I lose everything. The ranch goes to auction, and I'm left with nothing." "That's true," Margaret acknowledged. "The risk is real. But Marcus, I've been working with horses for more than 20 years. I know how to care for them properly. The risk of something serious happening in 3 months is relatively small, though certainly not non-existent." She stood, gesturing for Marcus to walk with her. They approached the paddock where Redemption was grazing, and Margaret continued speaking. "Your father built his ranch on calculated risks and belief in potential. He took horses that others thought were worthless and transformed them into valuable animals. He built something that lasted. That legacy isn't just in the land or the structures, it's in the philosophy he passed on to you. The question you have to ask yourself is whether you're going to honor that legacy by taking the safe choice, or by taking the choice that requires the courage your father demonstrated." They spent the rest of the day with the horses, Margaret showed Marcus the training protocols she was using with Redemption, explained the exercises being done to rebuild strength, discussed the behavioral work being conducted to ensure the horse was responding appropriately to human direction. By the end of the day, Marcus's confidence in Margaret's capabilities had solidified. She knew what she was doing. The horse was in genuinely good hands. As Marcus prepared to leave, Margaret offered him a proposition. She would provide weekly updates about Redemption's progress. If at any point Marcus decided he needed the immediate money, the buyer remained willing to pay $800. But she believed, based on what she'd seen in just these first 3 weeks, that waiting would be worth it. "One more thing," Margaret said as Marcus was mounting his horse to depart. "That buyer from Austin, he asked me something interesting. He asked if you'd ever considered working in the horse trade professionally. He said anyone with the instinct to see what you saw in Redemption and the patience to invest in developing that potential could build a significant business around identifying and rehabilitating quality horses." The suggestion lingered in Marcus's mind during the ride back to Clearwater Valley. It was absurd, obviously. He had no experience in horse trading. He had no capital to invest. He had a ranch about to be auctioned off and a future that was entirely uncertain. But absurdity, he was learning, was sometimes just another word for possibility. The final week before the auction passed in a strange haze. Marcus completed the process of shutting down the ranch operations. He sold off remaining equipment and supplies, using the proceeds to purchase a few additional weeks of lodging. He visited the cemetery where his father was buried and sat beside the grave for several hours, not speaking, just existing in the space where his family's history was most visibly marked. On the evening before the auction, he received a final letter from Margaret. Redemption had passed a major milestone in its recovery. Margaret's assessment was that the horse would likely exceed even the most optimistic projections for its value. The buyer from Austin was continuing to express strong interest. She was recommending that Marcus allow her to facilitate an auction among serious buyers once the horse was fully ready, as the competitive bidding would likely result in a higher final price than any single buyer would offer. Marcus sat with that letter and made his decision. He would wait. He would trust that his instinct to see potential in Redemption was sound. He would honor his father's philosophy by taking the path that required faith rather than fear. The auction happened without his presence. He learned afterward that the property sold for a price that would cover the back taxes and leave a small amount for Marcus to carry forward. It wasn't enough to change anything materially, but it was enough to ensure he wasn't completely destitute. As he prepared to leave Clearwater Valley for San Antonio, Marcus made a final visit to the cemetery. Standing at his father's grave, he spoke aloud for the first time in years. "I'm going to try something," he said. "I'm going to wait for redemption to become what I believe it can become. I'm going to see if that instinct you taught me is actually valuable, or if I'm just fooling myself. Either way, I'm going to find out." The wind moved through the cemetery, and Marcus imagined it as his father's response, not words, but acknowledgement that the choice made sense. San Antonio was nothing like Clearwater Valley. The city sprawled across the landscape with a density and complexity that Marcus found simultaneously fascinating and overwhelming. Buildings towered higher than anything in his experience. Streets teemed with people from backgrounds and nationalities that seemed impossibly diverse compared to the homogeneous ranching community he'd grown up in. The sounds were constant: wagon wheels on cobblestone, vendors calling out their wares, conversations in languages Marcus didn't recognize. Catherine had arranged for lodging in a boarding house near the merchant district where her husband Thomas conducted business. The room was small but clean, and Catherine herself was waiting when Marcus arrived, embracing him with a warmth that surprised him, given how long it had been since they'd seen each other in person. "You look tired," she said, her tone suggesting this observation came from genuine concern rather than judgment. "And older than I expected. I've had a difficult few years," Marcus replied, which was adequate understatement. Thomas appeared that evening with Catherine, and the three of them shared dinner. Thomas was a pragmatic man, someone who'd built a successful merchant business through careful calculation and risk assessment. He listened as Marcus briefly explained the situation with the ranch and the horse, his expression growing increasingly skeptical as the story progressed. "So, you're waiting for a horse to appreciate in value," Thomas summarized when Marcus finished speaking. "A horse that was worthless enough to sell for 50 cents, purchased with money you didn't have? And your entire financial future depends on this animal becoming sufficiently valuable to justify the wait." "That's one way of characterizing it," Marcus acknowledged. Thomas exchanged a look with Catherine. "I appreciate your optimism, Marcus. I truly do. But I think you need to understand the reality of your situation. You have no income. You have no employment prospects that I'm aware of. You're dependent on the goodwill of your sister and my willingness to support you indefinitely. That's not a sustainable situation, regardless of what happens with the horse." Catherine interjected before Marcus could respond. "What Thomas is saying, without being particularly diplomatic about it, is that you need employment. Immediately. Not in 3 months when the horse might be ready for sale, but now." She paused, then continued. "Thomas has a proposition. There's a man named Henry Copley who manages a large ranching operation about 30 miles outside San Antonio. He's looking for someone to manage his breeding program and help evaluate livestock for purchase. It's not glamorous work, and the pay is modest, but it's employment. It would give you income and stability while you wait for your horse situation to resolve." Marcus felt a complex mixture of gratitude and resistance. The offer was generous, a lifeline in concrete form, but it also felt like an admission of failure, accepting employment that was essentially charity dressed in professional terminology. "I could speak with him," Marcus said carefully, "but I should be honest about my experience. I'm not a professional livestock evaluator. I'm just a rancher whose ranch failed." "You're more than that," Catherine said firmly. "You're someone who saw value in an animal that literally everyone else dismissed. That's an instinct, Marcus. That's exactly what someone like Henry Copley would want in someone managing a breeding program." The meeting with Henry Copley took place 3 days later at his ranch outside the city. Copley was perhaps 60, a successful rancher who'd built his operation through conservative expansion and careful breeding. He listened as Marcus explained his background, his experience with horses and cattle, and his current situation with redemption. Copley seemed particularly interested in the story of purchasing the horse at auction. "Margaret Ashford mentioned you," Copley said you had good instincts about animal potential. She doesn't offer praise easily, so that carried weight with me. He paused, studying Marcus with the evaluative gaze of someone accustomed to making judgments about people. I'll be direct. The job I'm offering pays $200 annually, plus room and board. It's not magnificent compensation, but it's honest work, and the person doing it has genuine responsibility for decisions that affect my operation significantly. I'd need flexibility regarding communication with Margaret about the horse's progress, Marcus said. Weekly letters and potentially travel to check on it. That's acceptable, Copley confirmed. Your employment is contingent on one thing, though. You need to prove you actually have the instincts you claim. I want you to evaluate my entire breeding stock, every animal on this ranch, and provide written assessments of their current value, their breeding potential, and recommendations for which animals should be kept, sold, or replaced. You have 2 weeks to complete this evaluation. If your assessments prove sound, you're employed. If they don't, we part ways. It was a test, and Marcus understood it as such. Copley wasn't being unreasonable, he was being prudent, hiring someone based on potential rather than proven track record was risky. The evaluation would provide concrete evidence of whether Marcus's instincts were reliable. Marcus spent the next 14 days conducting what amounted to the most intensive study of livestock he'd ever undertaken. He examined every animal on Copley's ranch, assessing conformation, temperament, breeding history, and current condition. He researched bloodlines through Copley's records. He spoke with the ranch hands about individual animals' behaviors and capabilities. He created detailed documentation of his findings and recommendations. When he presented his conclusions to Copley, Marcus was conscious of the fact that his entire near-term future potentially depended on this evaluation's validity. He'd recommended keeping approximately 60% of the cattle and horses currently on the ranch, selling approximately 30%, and replacing approximately 10% with specifically sought animals. His reasoning was detailed and comprehensive, not vague. Intuition, but concrete assessment grounded in observable characteristics and historical data. Copley reviewed the evaluation silently for more than an hour before speaking. These recommendations are sound, Copley said finally. I disagree with 1 or 2 of your specific assessments, but your overall methodology is solid, and your conclusions align with what I've observed over years of managing this operation. You're employed, Marcus. Start immediately. The work provided structure that Marcus hadn't realized he desperately needed. Each day had clear purpose, evaluating animals, maintaining records, consulting with ranch hands about specific horses or cattle, making recommendations about breeding decisions. It was intellectually engaging in ways that pure ranching work hadn't been, requiring him to think analytically about animal genetics and potential rather than simply reacting to immediate practical needs. Over the following weeks, as Marcus settled into the routine, weekly, letters from Margaret began arriving with increasing regularity. The pattern was consistent. Redemption's condition continued to improve dramatically. The horse was being worked with regularly, demonstrating responsiveness to training that exceeded Margaret's expectations. The physical changes continued as well. The animal was filling out, becoming muscular and capable, with movement that suggested both power and grace. More significantly, Margaret began reporting on the horse's temperament. Redemption was becoming not just physically capable, but psychologically confident. The animal was bonding with handlers, demonstrating intelligence and willingness. Margaret wrote in one letter that she'd had multiple inquiries from buyers who'd seen the horse, all expressing strong interest. But she was recommending against accepting any offers yet, as the horse was entering the phase of training where significant additional value could be unlocked. 4 months after Marcus had arrived in San Antonio, he received a letter that changed his trajectory entirely. It came from Harrison, the buyer from Austin, who'd initially expressed interest in Redemption. The letter indicated that he'd been following Margaret's reports on the horse's progress. He was now prepared to make a formal offer of $2,000 for the fully trained horse, contingent on the horse meeting specific performance criteria that Margaret would verify. $2,000. Marcus sat with that letter for an entire evening, unable to quite process what it represented. $2,000 was more money than he would earn in a decade working for Henry Copley. It was enough to purchase land. It was enough to restart the ranch operation. It was enough to fundamentally alter his circumstances. But it was also contingent on redemption continuing its remarkable recovery for another 2 months. The risk remained real. Despite Margaret's expertise and careful management, he discussed the letter with Catherine and Thomas over dinner that evening. Thomas, despite his earlier skepticism, was becoming genuinely impressed by how the situation was developing. "This validates your initial instinct," Thomas said. "You saw value that others missed, and you had the patience to allow that value to develop. That's a genuinely unusual skill set, Marcus. The question," Catherine added, "is what you do with this money when you receive it. Do you use it to reclaim a ranching operation? Do you do something entirely different?" Marcus didn't have an answer to that question yet. The past several months had changed his perspective on what he wanted from life. Working for Copley, he'd discovered that the intellectual challenge of evaluating animals and making strategic breeding decisions was deeply satisfying in ways that simple ranching work had never been. The idea of returning to operating a small, independent ranch suddenly seemed limiting rather than aspirational. Margaret suggested something in her last letter, Marcus said slowly. She proposed a business partnership. She would continue her rehabilitation and training work. I would identify animals with potential at auctions, livestock sales, and from farmers or ranchers looking to offload animals they consider worthless. We'd share in the profits from rehabilitating and selling those animals. "That's actually brilliant," Thomas said immediately. "You'd leverage your instinct for identifying value. Margaret would leverage her expertise in rehabilitation and training. You'd be building a business around a repeatable model that clearly works." "It would mean leaving Henry's employment," Marcus noted. "Henry would understand," Copley said a moment later. Marcus hadn't realized the older rancher had arrived while they were discussing the letter. Copley had become increasingly friendly since Marcus proved his evaluative skills, frequently stopping by San Antonio to check on Marcus's work and occasionally joining them for dinner. "I've been hoping you'd eventually figure out what your actual talent is," Copley continued, "and it's not managing my ranch. Your talent is seeing potential in animals and people that others miss. That's a rare gift, Marcus. You should build something around it." The conversation shifted direction after Copley's arrival, but the seed had been planted. As Marcus returned to his boarding room that evening, he found himself imagining a future that looked dramatically different from anything he'd previously considered. Not as a rancher protecting something inherited, but as a businessman building something new. Not alone, but in partnership with someone who understood the animal rehabilitation side of the operation as thoroughly as he understood the evaluation side. 2 weeks before the scheduled completion of Redemption's training, Margaret sent a letter that was notably different in tone from the previous updates. She requested that Marcus come to her facility personally. Something had developed that required discussion in person. The letter was brief and offered no additional details, which sent anxiety flooding through Marcus. His first thought was that something had gone wrong with the horse, some injury or illness that threatened the animal's recovery. Marcus took a day off from work and made the ride to Margaret's ranch, with trepidation steadily building. He arrived in the late afternoon and found Margaret waiting for him at the barn. Rather than looking troubled, her expression carried satisfaction mixed with something like excitement. "Come see," she said simply, leading him toward the training area. In the corral, Redemption was being worked through a series of exercises with a trainer named Robert. The horse moved with a fluidity that was almost shocking. Where months earlier there had been pain and hesitation in every motion, there was now confidence and capability. The animal's body was muscular and powerful, its coat brilliant in the afternoon light. But what struck Marcus most profoundly was the horse's bearing. The way it carried itself suggested an animal that had completely reorganized its internal sense of what was possible. "Watch what happens next," Margaret instructed. Robert dismounted and stood in front of the horse, holding the reins loosely. Without any visible command, Redemption stepped forward and lowered its head, pressing its forehead against Robert's chest. The gesture was affectionate, deeply connected, suggesting a bond between horse and handler that transcended typical training relationships. "This horse doesn't just accept work anymore," Margaret explained. "It loves the work. It's transformed from an animal that was surviving into an animal that's thriving. More than that, it's intelligent enough to develop genuine preferences and emotional attachments." She turned to face Marcus directly. "I've been managing horses for more than 2 decades, Marcus. I've rehabilitated dozens of animals. I've never seen a port recovery like this one. This horse went from being literally hours from death to being one of the finest animals I've ever worked with. That transformation happened because you saw something worth investing in." They walked through the facility as Margaret provided detailed updates on everything that had been accomplished. The horse's conditioning program had exceeded all expectations. Its response to training was exemplary. Multiple buyers were expressing serious interest, and Harrison had confirmed his offer remained valid. "But here's what I wanted to discuss in person," Margaret said, her tone shifting to something more serious. "I had a thought about this horse that I wanted to run by you. Instead of selling Redemption to Harrison, what if we kept it?" Marcus looked at her, confused. "Kept it how?" "As the foundation of a breeding program," Margaret explained. "Not just any breeding program, but one specifically designed to identify and acquire mares with similar genetic potential to Redemption. We could breed this horse strategically, creating offspring with the same inherent quality. Within 5 to 10 years, we could have a bloodline that's recognized across Texas for its exceptional characteristics." She paused, letting the possibility settle into Marcus's mind. "It would require capital investment that neither of us currently possesses," Margaret continued. "But Harrison's $2,000 could serve as starting capital. We'd need to establish a proper facility, purchase breeding stock, develop a network for identifying potential acquisitions. It would be building a business from essentially nothing, but we'd be building it on something that works on this horse's genetics and the model we've already proven with Redemption's rehabilitation. You're proposing we go into business together," Marcus said slowly. "I'm proposing exactly that," Margaret confirmed. "You have instincts for identifying potential in animals that are genuinely exceptional. I have expertise in rehabilitation and training. Together, we could build something significant. Not just profitable, but something that changes how people think about animal value and potential." The partnership agreement between Marcus Webb and Margaret Ashford was formalized over the course of 3 weeks, though the foundational conversation happened within hours of Margaret's initial proposal. They met with Thomas, who'd become something of an informal advisor on business matters, and constructed a framework that would allow them to pool resources and establish a legitimate operation. The structure was straightforward. Margaret would contribute her existing facility, her expertise, and her established reputation in the horse rehabilitation community. Marcus would contribute capital from Harrison's purchase, his instinct for identifying animals with potential, and his proven ability to evaluate bloodlines and conformation. Profits would be split equally, and major decisions would require both partners' agreement. It was a model based entirely on mutual trust and complementary skills, exactly what Catherine suggested was the strongest foundation for any partnership. Harrison accepted their counter-proposal with grace. Instead of purchasing Redemption outright, he agreed to provide the capital Marcus needed through a loan structure with favorable terms. In exchange, Harrison would have first right of refusal on any offspring produced from Redemption's breeding line. It was an arrangement that benefited all parties. Marcus and Margaret got their starting capital without giving up the horse, and Harrison secured access to a potentially valuable bloodline at terms that reflected his early faith in the operation. The first physical location for their operation was established approximately 40 miles north of Margaret's existing facility, on land that had been available for lease at a reasonable rate. Marcus used the early weeks to construct basic infrastructure: corrals, barn space, and modest accommodations for working with horses. Margaret simultaneously began the process of identifying potential acquisition candidates, reaching out to contacts across Texas who might know of animals in situations similar to Redemption's. What emerged over the following months was a system that, in retrospect, seemed almost obvious, but was genuinely innovative for the time. They would identify animals that had been deemed worthless: elderly horses, animals with visible flaws, animals that had been neglected or abused. They would acquire these animals at minimal cost, often negotiating directly with owners who were relieved to have someone take problem animals off their hands. They would then subject these animals to Margaret's rehabilitation protocols, while Marcus conducted detailed assessments of their underlying genetic and conformation potential. The crucial insight was that physical condition and behavioral trauma could obscure fundamental quality. An elderly horse with poor conformation would likely always have poor conformation, but an animal that was inherently well-built could recover from neglect. An intelligent animal could overcome behavioral trauma if given proper rehabilitation. By focusing exclusively on identifying animals where the underlying structure and genetics were sound, they could virtually guarantee successful rehabilitation and resale. The first acquisition after Redemption was a mare named Duchess, purchased from a farmer who decided she was too old to breed further. She was perhaps 15 years old, showing her age, with obvious signs of previous neglect. But her conformation was exceptional, and her bloodline, when Marcus researched it, connected to several renowned breeding lines. After 3 months of rehabilitation and conditioning, Duchess was a visibly different animal. Her coat restored to lustrous quality, her muscle tone rebuilt, her behavioral issues resolved. The second acquisition was a stallion that had been seized by territorial authorities from a man who'd been actively abusing it. The animal was traumatized, dangerous, and initially almost unmanageable. But Margaret worked with patience and expertise, gradually rebuilding the horse's trust in human handlers. Marcus assessed the animal's underlying structure and determined that despite its behavioral problems, it possessed genuinely exceptional conformation and genetic indicators. By the end of the first year, Marcus and Margaret had acquired 8 animals, successfully rehabilitated 6 of them, and sold 4 at prices that reflected their restored quality. More importantly, they'd established a reputation within the ranching and horse trading community as people who understood something fundamental about animal potential that others missed. Redemption, meanwhile, had become the centerpiece of their operation. The horse was standing at stud, beginning the process of producing offspring that would inherit its exceptional qualities. The first breeding had resulted in 2 foals, both showing early indicators of inheriting their sire's genetic advantages. The business was beginning to generate revenue beyond the rehabilitation and resale operations. Wealthy ranchers were paying premium prices for the opportunity to breed mares with Redemption. Harrison had been true to his word, maintaining close involvement with the operation and providing strategic guidance based on his own experience in the horse trade. He'd become something of a mentor to Marcus, helping him understand market dynamics and pricing strategies. More significantly, Harrison had introduced Marcus and Margaret to other serious buyers and breeders, expanding their network substantially. During this first year, Marcus had maintained his employment with Henry Copley, using his evenings and days off to work on the rehabilitation operation. But as the business grew and the time commitments increased, it became clear that maintaining both positions was no longer feasible. The conversation about his departure came naturally. "You need to commit to this fully," Copley said when Marcus finally raised the possibility. "Half your attention isn't going to be sufficient for what you and Margaret are building. You're creating something significant, Marcus. Something that could generate real wealth and establish a reputation that extends beyond this valley. I'd be foolish to ask you to compromise that for my operation." Copley did more than simply accept Marcus's resignation. He provided a recommendation to the ranching community that was instrumental in establishing Marcus's credibility. Copley's endorsement, coming from a well-respected operator with no financial interest in Marcus's success, carried weight that business performance alone couldn't have generated. When Copley told people that Marcus Webb understood animal potential better than anyone he'd met, that assessment influenced how other breeders and ranchers viewed the partnership. By the end of the second year, the operation had expanded significantly. They'd established satellite locations for housing animals during rehabilitation, allowing them to work with more animals simultaneously. They'd hired additional staff, including a veterinarian who worked part-time to ensure the rehabilitation protocols were medically sound. Most importantly, they'd established a systematic approach that was producing consistently successful outcomes. The second breeding cycle from redemption had produced 4 foals, all showing indicators of exceptional quality. Several wealthy ranchers had already expressed interest in purchasing breeding rights to these offspring once they reached maturity. The business model that had seemed radical during those initial uncertain months was now demonstrating its viability repeatedly. It was during the second year that an opportunity emerged that fundamentally changed the scope of what was possible. A rancher named Edward Foster from Dallas contacted Marcus with an unusual proposition. Foster owned a significant ranching operation and had become aware of Marcus and Margaret's work through Harrison. He wanted to establish a formal partnership where Foster would provide capital for land acquisition and facility expansion, and in exchange would receive a percentage of profits and preferential access to the horses they produced. The offer was substantial enough capital to establish a genuinely significant operation rather than the scaled-up version of Margaret's initial facility. But it also represented a shift from a partnership between two people to something more complex and institutionalized. Marcus consulted extensively with Margaret before responding. "This is what success looks like," Margaret said when they discussed it. "Expansion, institutional investment, the opportunity to build something that lasts beyond either of us. It's worth considering seriously. It's also the point where we lose control," Marcus countered. "Once Foster puts in significant capital, decisions are no longer entirely ours to make." "That's true," Margaret acknowledged. "But Marcus, we've already proven the concept works. We've demonstrated that our approach to identifying and rehabilitating horses generates value. What we're lacking now is capital and infrastructure to operate at scale. Foster solves both problems." The partnership with Foster was negotiated over several months, resulting in an agreement that established a formal company, Webb Ashford Horse Operations, with Foster as a major shareholder and member of the governing board. The agreement provided for capital investment sufficient to acquire significant acreage near Dallas, construct modern facilities, and establish a breeding and rehabilitation operation of genuine scale. More importantly, the agreement created a path for Marcus and Margaret to generate wealth at a level neither had previously imagined possible. The business would operate profitably almost immediately, with expansion generating increasing returns. The move to the new Dallas area location happened in the spring of the third year. The facility was substantially larger than anything Marcus or Margaret had previously worked, with barns designed for efficient livestock management, corrals built to modern specifications, accommodations for staff that made it possible to attract experienced workers. Redemption was relocated to a premier stud facility where the horse's reproductive potential could be optimized. It was during the transition to the new location that Marcus received unexpected news. A letter arrived from Thomas indicating that he wanted to invest in the operation personally. Thomas had been following the business's development closely, and was convinced of its fundamental viability. He wanted to provide additional capital in exchange for a minority stake in the company. The offer was significant, not for the capital it represented, though that was substantial, but for what it signaled. Thomas was, despite his initial skepticism about Marcus's horse investment, now convinced that the business model was sound and the partners capable of executing it successfully. His investment was validation from someone with genuine business experience and financial acumen. By the end of the third year, Webb Ashford Horse Operations had expanded to managing over 50 animals in various stages of rehabilitation, had established breeding lines from Redemption and several other exceptional animals, and was generating revenue that exceeded what Marcus could have earned in a decade of traditional ranching. More significantly, the operation had begun to establish a reputation as the premier source for quality horses in the Texas ranching community. Marcus stood in the new facility one morning, watching Redemption in the stud facility, and reflected on the path that had led from purchasing the horse for 50 cents to operating a sophisticated breeding and rehabilitation business. The horse had recovered completely from its initial state of neglect. It was now in excellent condition, well managed, and actively contributing to the business's financial success through its breeding activities. But what struck Marcus most was the simplicity of the principle that had generated this outcome. He'd seen potential where others saw only loss. He'd had the patience to allow that potential to develop. He'd partnered with someone who had complementary skills and shared vision. And from those fundamental choices, prosperity had emerged. The business continued to grow steadily through the subsequent years. New animals were acquired and rehabilitated. Bloodlines were carefully managed to enhance desirable traits. The reputation of Webb Ashford Horse Operations expanded across Texas and into neighboring territories. Horses bearing their breeding carried premium prices. Ranchers sought out their animals, specifically viewing acquisition from Webb Ashford as an investment in quality genetics. Harrison, the original buyer who'd never actually purchased Redemption, had continued his involvement with the operation. His early faith in Marcus's instincts had been vindicated completely. Redemption's offspring were proving exceptional, and Harrison had built his own breeding operation around animals sourced from Webb Ashford. Catherine and Thomas visited the new facility in the fourth year after the ranch auction, and Catherine walked through the barns with visible emotion. "You did it," she said simply. "You took a terrible situation and somehow built something remarkable from it." "I had help," Marcus replied, thinking of Margaret, of Harrison, of Copley's early guidance, of Thomas's investment, and Catherine's emotional support. "I had people who believed in what I was attempting, even when the odds seemed impossible." "That's part of understanding potential," Thomas said, having overheard. "The exchange. It's not just about seeing it in animals, it's about recognizing it in people as well. You recognized it in yourself when you purchased that horse for 50 cents. You recognized it in Margaret when you partnered with her. That capacity to see possibility where others see only failure, that's what generated this success." As the sun set over the Dallas area facility that evening, Marcus thought back to that day at the livestock auction in Clearwater Valley. He'd been a man with nothing but desperation and loose change. He'd made a choice that seemed foolish to everyone who witnessed it. And that choice had transformed not just his own circumstances, but had created something that would outlast him. A business model that proved repeatedly that value exists where others fail to see it. That potential can be cultivated through patience and expertise, and that transformation is possible for anyone willing to invest the time and belief required to facilitate it. 5 years into the operation, Webb Ashford Horse Operations had become something none of the founders had quite anticipated. Not just a successful business, but an institution within the Texas ranching community. The facility near Dallas had expanded 3 times, now encompassing nearly 500 acres with multiple specialized areas for breeding, rehabilitation, and training. The workforce had grown from Margaret and Marcus working primarily alone to a professional staff of nearly 30 people, including veterinarians, trainers, bloodline specialists, and administrative personnel. But success at this scale created complications that hadn't existed during the early years when the operation was smaller and more personal. Decisions that had once been made collaboratively between Margaret and Marcus now required consideration of investor interests, staff concerns, and market dynamics that extended far beyond the simple principle of identifying and rehabilitating quality animals. The first significant conflict emerged regarding expansion strategy. Edward Foster, whose capital had been instrumental in establishing the Dallas facility, proposed acquiring additional property to establish a second location in North Texas. The expansion would allow the operation to work with more animals simultaneously and establish a presence in a market that was underserved by quality horse breeders. Margaret supported the expansion enthusiastically. She saw it as an opportunity to increase their capacity to help animals while simultaneously expanding revenue. Marcus was less certain. The expansion would require significant capital investment and would necessitate hiring and managing additional staff. More fundamentally, expansion meant the operation would become less personal, less connected to the foundational principle that had generated their success. "We built this by being selective," Marcus argued during a partnership meeting, "by carefully choosing which animals to work with, by maintaining standards that others didn't. If we expand too rapidly, we risk becoming just another operation focused on volume rather than quality." "We can maintain quality while expanding," Foster countered. "We have systems in place. We have qualified staff. We have proven methods. There's no reason expansion requires compromising quality." "In theory, no," Margaret interjected, her tone suggesting she'd been thinking carefully about this. "But Marcus has a point. Our reputation was built on being selective, on refusing to take animals we didn't believe in. That selectivity is part of what makes us valuable. If we become willing to rehabilitate anything that comes to us, we become commoditized." The discussion continued over several meetings, eventually resulting in a compromise. They would expand, but selectively. A second location would be established, but it would operate under the same quality standards as the primary facility. Expansion would be controlled and gradual rather than aggressive. The compromise satisfied no one completely, but it was acceptable to all parties, which Thomas pointed out later was the sign of a genuinely fair negotiation. It was during this period of internal discussion about expansion that Marcus received a visitor who would change the trajectory of his thinking about the business fundamentally. The visitor was a journalist named Robert Mitchell from a Dallas newspaper who'd heard about Webb Ashford's operation and wanted to write a feature story about the business model. "What interests me," Mitchell explained over coffee at the facility's office, "is not just that you're successful, but how you became successful. You took a horse that cost 50 cents and transformed it into the foundation of a significant business. That's not a common story." "It's not a story of genius," Marcus said carefully. "It's a story of seeing potential and having the time and resources to develop it." Mitchell leaned forward. "But that's exactly why the story matters. Because what you did wasn't magical or complicated. You saw something others missed. You invested in it. You partnered with people who had complementary skills. Those are accessible principles. They're replicable. That's what makes this story significant." The resulting article, published 3 weeks later, reached far beyond the local ranching community. Eastern newspapers picked it up. Agricultural publications featured it. Suddenly, Marcus and Margaret found themselves receiving inquiries from people who wanted to learn about their methodology, establish partnerships, or invest in the operation. More significantly, they began receiving inquiries from ranchers and horse breeders who'd read about their approach and wanted to apply similar principles to their own operations. Some were seeking partnerships. Others wanted Margaret to provide consulting on rehabilitation techniques. Still others wanted to purchase animals specifically because of their connection to the Webb-Ashford bloodline. It was one such inquiry that sparked the idea that would define the next phase of the operation. A rancher named Samuel Winters from Oklahoma contacted Marcus about the possibility of establishing a satellite operation in Oklahoma. Winters had read about Webb-Ashford's model and wanted to implement a similar approach in his state, but he lacked the expertise and established network that Marcus and Margaret possessed. "I have capital," Winters explained during an extensive correspondence. "I have land. What I lack is the knowledge of how to identify animals with potential and the expertise to rehabilitate them properly. I'm proposing that you establish a Webb-Ashford operation in Oklahoma under my funding. I would own it, but you would provide the methodology and oversight." The proposal was radically different from anything Webb-Ashford had previously attempted. Rather than directly operating the expansion, they would be licensing their approach and providing consulting services. It was a way to scale the impact of their model without requiring proportional increases in capital or direct operational involvement. Margaret saw it immediately as transformative. "This is how we transform this from a business into a movement," she said. "This is how the principles we've developed, seeing potential, investing in rehabilitation, understanding bloodlines, get applied not just by us, but by others operating independently." Marcus needed more convincing, but eventually the logic became clear. By allowing others to implement their model under Webb-Ashford oversight, they could expand their influence and financial success simultaneously without the operational complexity of direct management. Over the next 2 years, 3 satellite operations were established in Oklahoma, in Kansas, and in New Mexico. Each operated under franchise arrangements where the operator paid licensing fees and purchased consulting services from Webb-Ashford in $, exchange for access to the methodology, bloodline information, and training protocols. Each also agreed to maintain quality standards consistent with the Webb-Ashford brand. The financial returns from these arrangements were significant, but more important was what they revealed. The model worked regardless of who implemented it. Ranchers who understood the foundational principles, see potential, invest in development, maintain quality standards, could successfully identify and rehabilitate animals. The specific people involved mattered less than the systematic approach. This realization led to perhaps the most significant decision Marcus and Margaret would make regarding the future of their business. They would formalize their methodology into a training program, establishing a school where they would teach the principles of animal evaluation and rehabilitation to people interested in learning. The Webb-Ashford Institute for Horse Evaluation and Rehabilitation was established in the 6th year of operation. It offered intensive training programs covering bloodline analysis, conformation assessment, rehabilitation protocols, and the business model that made animal rehabilitation profitable. The first class had only 8 students, but within 3 years, the institute was training 30 to 40 people annually, many of whom went on to establish their own operations using Webb-Ashford principles. Some of these satellite operations became significant successes. Others failed, unable to successfully apply the principles or locate sufficient quality animals to rehabilitate, but each success validated the core principle that had driven Marcus's initial 50-cent investment, that potential exists where others fail to see it, and systematic approaches to identifying and developing that potential are replicable and scalable. It was during the establishment of the Institute that Marcus reconnected with Thomas in a way that shifted their relationship from business partnership to something more deeply collaborative. Thomas had been following the expansion of Webb-Ashford with growing interest, and he proposed something that would integrate the operation more fully with his merchant business. "What if we created a formal distribution network?" Thomas suggested. "Right now, you're selling horses individually to ranchers who approach you or learn about you through reputation. But what if we established a system where quality horses from Webb Ashford operations could be made available through a network of distributors? What if we created a brand that was immediately recognizable and trusted across multiple states?" The proposal was ambitious. It meant treating horses less as individual animals and more as products in a distribution system. Margaret was initially resistant to the language, concerned that framing their animals as products would somehow diminish the care and attention they received. But Marcus understood what Thomas was proposing. It wasn't about treating individual animals callously. It was about scaling distribution to reach more people who could benefit from quality horses. It was about creating an infrastructure that made excellent breeding stock accessible not just to wealthy ranchers, but to working ranchers and farmers throughout the region. "We're not diminishing the animals," Marcus explained to Margaret. "We're respecting them by ensuring they reach people who can use them effectively. A horse bred from Redemption's line that ends up with a farmer in Kansas will contribute to that farmer's economic success. That's honoring what we've built, not compromising it." Margaret's resistance softened, and within a year, Thomas had established the distribution network. Quality Webb Ashford horses could now be accessed through a system of regional distributors who understood the animal's value and could match them appropriately with buyers. The system generated substantial additional revenue while simultaneously expanding the operation's reach dramatically. By the end of the 6th year, Webb Ashford horse operations had transformed from a local operation into something with genuine regional significance. The original 50-cent investment in Redemption had generated a business generating 6 figures in annual revenue. More importantly, the principles underlying that initial investment had been formalized, systematized, and shared with dozens of operators who were successfully applying them in different locations. It was during this period of expansion and success that Marcus received a letter that brought him back to his roots. The letter came from James Harley, who'd purchased the original Webb family ranch at the territorial auction. Harley indicated that he'd read about Marcus's success in the newspaper and wanted to reconnect. More importantly, Harley wanted to discuss the possibility of leasing the original ranch property from its current owners to establish a new Webb Ashford satellite location. The proposal was poetic in its completeness. The land that had nearly been lost to tax foreclosure could become part of the expanded Webb Ashford network. Marcus could return to Clearwater Valley not as a failed rancher, but as the founder of a successful operation expanding back to his roots. "You should do it," Catherine said when Marcus shared the proposal with her. "It completes something. It honors your father's legacy by rebuilding his ranch as something greater than it was." Marcus made the journey back to Clearwater Valley for the first time since the auction. The town had changed, new buildings had been constructed, others had deteriorated further. But the landscape remained fundamentally familiar, the mountains in the distance the same, the creek running through the valley unchanged by human commerce and failure. Standing at the boundary of the original Webb family property, Marcus felt the weight of his full journey compressed into a single moment, the desperation of that day when the bank notice had arrived, the 50-cent investment in a horse no one else wanted. The years of careful building and expansion and formalization of principles that had grown organically from a single decision made in a moment of desperation. The new Clearwater Valley location for Webb Ashford operations would be smaller than the Dallas flagship, but it would operate according to the same principles. Horses would be identified, rehabilitated, and either sold or integrated into breeding programs. The original principle would be honored: see potential where others see only loss, invest in development, maintain quality standards, and build sustainable value. As Marcus rode back toward town that evening, he thought about his father and the journals he'd kept. Daniel Webb had understood something fundamental about potential and its cultivation. He'd built a ranch on those principles, And while that ranch had been lost to circumstances beyond anyone's control, the SAN principles themselves had survived. They'd been tested, refined, and systematized, and now they were being applied not just by one man on one ranch, but by dozens of operators across multiple states. That, Marcus realized, was the truest form of legacy, not the preservation of specific property or wealth, but the transmission of principles that allowed others to build their own success based on the same foundational understanding. The 8th year of Webb Ashford operations began with what seemed like unlimited positive momentum. The business had expanded to 6 satellite locations across 3 states. The distribution network Thomas had established was functioning effectively, moving quality horses to buyers throughout the region. The Institute was training a new cohort of operators who would establish their own franchised operations. Revenue had grown to a level that seemed almost abstract numbers on financial statements that bore little connection to the tangible reality of horses and ranches. But success at scale creates vulnerabilities that smaller operations don't face. Those vulnerabilities became apparent when a significant problem emerged at one of the satellite locations in Kansas. The Kansas operation, managed by a man named Robert Thorne, who'd been one of the Institute's first graduates, had been operating successfully for 2 years. But during a routine audit of the facility's records, Thomas discovered discrepancies in animal inventory that didn't align with financial reporting. Specifically, animals that had been purchased and paid for according to financial records weren't physically present at the facility. The investigation that followed was deeply uncomfortable. It revealed that Thorne had been systematically falsifying records to hide the fact that he was using Webb Ashford methodology and facilities to operate an unauthorized breeding program on the side. He was acquiring animals through Webb Ashford channels, registering them as part of the satellite operation, but then selling them privately and pocketing the profits. The fraud was substantial, approximately $15,000 in unauthorized sales and misappropriated animals. More damaging than the financial loss was what it revealed about the vulnerability of the franchise model. Thorne had been trusted because he'd successfully completed the Institute training and had demonstrated competence in implementing the Webb Ashford methodology. But trust alone was insufficient protection against someone willing to deliberately violate that trust. Marcus was devastated by the revelation. Margaret was angry, which proved more productive. Thomas was pragmatic, viewing it as a problem that required systematic resolution rather than as a failure of judgment. Edward Foster saw it as an opportunity to tighten controls and establish more rigorous oversight mechanisms. "This is what happens when you scale operations," Foster said during the partnership meeting called to address the situation. "You lose the ability to personally oversee everything. You become vulnerable to people exploiting the systems you've created." "Then, we need to create better systems," Margaret countered. "We need oversight mechanisms that catch problems before they become significant. We need auditing procedures and accountability structures." The resolution of the Kansas situation required several actions. Thorne was removed from his position, and legal action was initiated to recover the misappropriated funds and animals. More importantly, a comprehensive audit was conducted of all satellite operations to ensure no similar problems existed elsewhere. The audit revealed no other significant frauds, but it did identify numerous operational inconsistencies that needed standardization. The response to these problems was to establish what became known as the Webb Ashford Operations Manual, a comprehensive document detailing every procedure, protocol, and standard that franchised operations were required to follow. It covered everything from animal acquisition procedures to financial reporting requirements to staff training protocols. It was exhaustively detailed, professionally written, and functionally transformed Webb Ashford from a loose association of operations using similar methodologies into something resembling a tightly controlled corporate structure. Margaret was instrumental in developing this manual, drawing on her years of hands-on experience to capture the principles that had worked consistently. But the process of formalizing those principles also revealed something neither Marcus nor Margaret had fully acknowledged, that the human element, the personal relationships, the case-by-case judgment calls that had characterized their early work were being systematized into rules and procedures. "We're creating something that will work even if the people implementing it don't fully understand the philosophy," Margaret observed one evening, while reviewing the draft manual. "That's necessary at scale, but it also means we're losing something. The magic was always in understanding the principle and applying it thoughtfully to specific situations. Rules applied mechanically will generate consistent but potentially mediocre results." "Is that a problem?" Marcus asked. "Our original goal was to demonstrate that the principle works. If it works consistently when applied mechanically, isn't that actually proof of the principle's validity?" "Theoretically, yes," Margaret said. "But I worry we're creating something that's successful financially but hollow philosophically. We came into this business because we understood that potential exists and deserves investment. We're creating an operation where people follow procedures without necessarily understanding the underlying values." The tension Margaret identified became increasingly apparent as the business continued to grow. The operations manual, necessary as it was, began to feel constraining to both founders. Decisions that had once been collaborative and thoughtful became adherence to established procedures. Animals were evaluated using standardized criteria rather than through the kind of nuanced assessment that had characterized their early work. The business was becoming more profitable and more predictable, but less innovative and less connected to the foundational principles that had generated the success initially. It was during this period of introspection that Marcus received an invitation that would shift his thinking profoundly. Samuel Winters, the Oklahoma operator who'd been one of the first satellite location managers, invited Marcus to visit his operation to discuss a proposal. When Marcus arrived, he found the Oklahoma facility operating at a level of sophistication that surprised him. Winters had expanded significantly beyond the original satellite location. He'd established breeding programs, developed relationships with ranchers throughout Oklahoma and Kansas, and built a reputation as a legitimate operator in his own right. "I want to buy out the Webb-Ashford connection," Winters said directly. "I want to operate independently. I've learned what I needed to learn. I've established my own reputation. The licensing arrangement benefits you far more than it benefits me at this point." Marcus was taken aback by the bluntness of the proposal. "You want to sever the franchise relationship?" "I do," Winters confirmed. "Not because I'm ungrateful. You and Margaret taught me a model that works, and I'm grateful for that. But Winters Horse Operations is now established. We don't need Webb-Ashford training or oversight. We're capable of operating independently, and independence would be more profitable than continuing to pay licensing fees and submit to auditing procedures." The conversation extended through the evening, and Winters laid out detailed reasoning for why the Webb-Ashford relationship had become constraining rather than beneficial. The operations manual had reduced his flexibility to adapt to local conditions. The audit procedures required reporting that added administrative overhead without adding value. The licensing fees, while not prohibitive, represented capital that could be used for expansion if independence was achieved. "I respect what you and Margaret have built," Winters said, "but you need to understand something. You created a system that works. That means that eventually the people using that system become capable of operating without you. You've democratized horse breeding and rehabilitation through your methodology. That's powerful, but it also means you're going to lose control of what you've created." The statement landed heavily because it contained a truth Marcus had been avoiding acknowledging. The success of the franchise model meant that successful franchisees would eventually become competitors. The training they received would eventually enable them to operate independently. The business model itself, once formalized and systematized, became something that could be replicated by others without ongoing Webb Ashford involvement. Marcus discussed the situation with Margaret and Thomas upon returning to Dallas. "He's right," Thomas said without hesitation, "and more significantly, he's not the only one. I'd estimate that within 5 years, at least half of your current franchisees will want to operate independently. They'll have learned enough to be confident in their own capabilities, and they'll resent paying fees for oversight they view as unnecessary." "So what do we do?" Margaret asked. "Accept the loss of control? Watch our methodology become generic as other people use it?" "We evolve," Thomas said. "We shift focus. Instead of trying to control the franchise operations through oversight and procedural compliance, we focus on what only Webb Ashford can do. Breeding and training at the highest level, we become the source of premium genetics rather than controllers of methodology." The proposal was to refocus Webb Ashford operations from being primarily a franchise operation to being primarily a breeding and training operation. The institute would continue, but less as a revenue source and more as a way to maintain standards and share knowledge. The franchise relationships would be allowed to evolve toward independence, with the understanding that independent operators using Webb Ashford principles would, in a sense, be extending the brand's influence, regardless of formal relationship. The flagship Dallas operation would be expanded to become genuinely world-class in terms of breeding and training. Animals of exceptional quality would be developed there, and their offspring would be made available to other operators. Webb Ashford would become known for the quality of its breeding stock rather than for controlling a network of franchised operations. It was a significant strategic shift, requiring Marcus and Margaret to reimagine what they were actually building. But as they worked through the implications, the logic became increasingly compelling. Rather than fighting against the inevitable trend of franchisees becoming independent, they would leverage it. Independent operators using Webb Ashford methodology would create demand for premium Webb Ashford genetics. That demand would generate revenue while simultaneously extending the influence of the principles that had originally driven the business. Over the next 2 years, the transition occurred methodically. Satellite locations were gradually transitioned toward independence, with licensing arrangements being phased out and relationships shifting from contractual obligations to voluntary associations. Some operators, including Winters, negotiated buyouts of their facilities, becoming genuinely independent entities. Others negotiated arrangements to continue purchasing breeding stock and utilizing consulting services on a per-project basis, rather than through ongoing licensing agreements. The result was that Webb Ashford transformed from a network of franchised operations into a more focused entity, a premium breeding operation with a reputation for identifying and developing exceptional animals. The flagship facility near Dallas became genuinely world-class, with infrastructure and expertise that allowed them to work with the finest animals in their portfolio. More importantly, this shift forced a return to foundational principles. Instead of overseeing multiple operations through procedural manuals, Marcus and Margaret were again personally involved in evaluating animals, making breeding decisions, and assessing potential. The work became intellectually engaging in ways that had diminished as the business had scaled through franchising. "This feels more like the original work," Margaret said one afternoon, watching a newly acquired mare being evaluated for placement into the breeding program. "We're back to asking fundamental questions about potential and value. The procedural overlay is still there, but it's not the dominant concern anymore." It was during this period of refocusing that Marcus made a decision that surprised everyone, except perhaps Margaret. He announced that he would be stepping back from day-to-day operational involvement in the business, transitioning to an advisory role. His daughter, Elizabeth, who'd grown up around the business and had demonstrated exceptional instinct for animal evaluation, would assume operational leadership alongside Margaret. "I'm not leaving the business," Marcus clarified in the announcement to the staff. I'm transitioning it. I came into this because I understood something about seeing potential. I've proven that principle works. Now, it's time for someone else to carry that forward, bringing their own perspective and instincts while maintaining the foundational values that have made this successful. The transition occurred smoothly because Elizabeth had been systematically prepared for the role. She understood the business intimately, had completed the institute training, had spent years learning from both Marcus and Margaret. She was ready in ways that wouldn't have been possible if the transition had been sudden. As Marcus stepped back from operational involvement, he found himself reflecting on the complete arc of the journey. From a desperate rancher with 50 cents and a 50-cent horse, to the founder of a significant regional operation, to someone transitioning that operation to the next generation. The specific business had changed many times, but the underlying principle had remained constant. See potential, invest in its development, and build something that lasts beyond your own involvement. What will you do now? Thomas asked during one of their regular discussions. I'm going to go back to Clearwater Valley, Marcus said, the original ranch property. I'm going to establish a training operation. They're not a commercial facility, but a place where people who are just beginning, like I was, can come to learn the principles. I want to work with people at the beginning of their journey, when they're still uncertain whether they're seeing potential or just being foolish. That's fitting, Thomas said. Completing the circle. Marcus smiled. Not completing it, expanding it. The work continues, just in different form. Clearwater Valley looked both exactly as Marcus remembered it and fundamentally different. The town had grown slightly, with new buildings interspersed among the weathered structures he'd known intimately. The landscape remained unchanged. The same mountains, the same creek, the same quality of light that had characterized his childhood. But he experienced it now through the lens of someone who'd left, failed, succeeded, and returned. The geography was familiar, but the man standing in it was unrecognizable to his younger self. The original Webb family ranch. Property had changed hands multiple times over the years. The most recent owner, a man named Douglas Hastings, had allowed the buildings to deteriorate and the land to lie largely fallow. When Marcus approached Hastings about purchasing the property, the negotiations were surprisingly straightforward. Hastings was ready to divest himself of property he'd never truly invested in, and Marcus was offering a price that reflected the land's actual value rather than what he might have hoped for. The purchase was formalized in the spring of the 10th year after Marcus had left Clearwater Valley. He spent the summer months overseeing restoration of the existing structures and construction of new facilities designed specifically for the training operation he envisioned. The work was physical and satisfying in ways that the administrative work of running Webb Ashford's commercial operations had never been. It was during this period that Margaret visited, driving up from Dallas to see what Marcus was creating. It's beautiful, she said, standing on the porch of the restored ranch house, looking out at the landscape, and it feels right. You've come full circle. Not quite full circle, Marcus said. My father built this ranch to operate successfully as a commercial operation. I'm building this to be a teaching facility. The goal is different, even if the location is the same. They walked through the facilities, and Marcus explained his vision. He wanted to establish a training program for people who had raw instinct about animals but lacked systematic knowledge. Not the intensive institute-level training that Webb Ashford provided, but something more foundational. He wanted to work with people at the moment they were deciding whether their instincts about potential were valuable or foolish. I want to be for them what Copley was for me, Marcus explained. Someone who recognized potential and gave them the space to develop it. I made 50-cent investments because I had nothing to lose. But I also made those investments because people I respected. Harlow, Copley, you took me seriously when I expressed my instincts. This facility will be a place where people can test their instincts under conditions where failure isn't catastrophic. Margaret nodded slowly. You're creating something that doesn't exist. There's no intermediate space between complete novice and professional operator. You're building that space. I'm trying to, Marcus said. Whether I succeed will depend on whether people recognize the value of what I'm offering. The first cohort of the Clearwater Valley Horse Evaluation and Development Program consisted of 8 students, recruited through word of mouth and announcements in ranching publications. They were a diverse group, a young rancher's daughter looking to operate independently, a farmer interested in breeding horses as a secondary enterprise, a former stable hand seeking to transition into management, several others, with varying levels of experience but consistent interest in understanding animal potential more deeply. The program was deliberately small and personal. Rather than the formalized curriculum of the Institute, it was structured around projects. Students would work with Marcus on evaluating animals, developing rehabilitation protocols, assessing breeding potential. The learning happened through hands-on work rather than classroom instruction. The first project involved acquiring a horse that had been deemed unrideable due to behavioral problems. The animal had been abused, had developed serious trust issues, and was being considered for humane destruction. Marcus presented the situation to the students and asked them to assess whether the horse had potential worth investing in. "Everyone sees a dangerous animal," Marcus said, showing them the horse. "The question is whether anyone sees a horse that's damaged but fundamentally sound. That's what you need to learn to do, see past the purport, damage, to what's underneath." Working together, the students examined the horse's physical structure, researched its bloodline, assessed its behavioral responses to different types of handling. Over the course of several weeks, they developed and implemented a rehabilitation protocol. The horse gradually became manageable, then cooperative, then genuinely responsive. By the end of the first program cycle, 3 of the 8 students had gone on to establish their own operations based on principles they'd learned. 2 others had returned to their existing ranching operations with new approaches to evaluating and managing animals. The remaining 3 decided that their instincts about animal potential weren't strong enough to build a career around, and they pursued other directions. That outcome, where not everyone who participated went on to build a career around the work, would have seemed like failure in a traditional educational context. But Marcus understood it as success. He'd created a space where people could test their instincts without catastrophic consequences. Some discovered genuine talent. Others discovered they were better suited to different pursuits. All of them had gained clarity about themselves and their capabilities. Word of the program spread within the ranching community. Applications for the second cohort substantially exceeded capacity. Marcus established a selection process to ensure he was working with people who had genuine instinct and commitment rather than simply curiosity. The second cohort was larger, 12 students, and included people from outside Texas who'd traveled to Clearwater Valley specifically to participate. Over the subsequent years, the program developed a reputation as a genuinely transformative experience. People who'd completed the program went on to establish successful operations throughout the Southwest. Several became sufficiently skilled that they eventually partnered with Webb Ashford, creating complex business relationships where the founder and the student organization worked collaboratively rather than hierarchically. Marcus maintained his advisory relationship with Webb Ashford throughout this period, participating in quarterly meetings and providing strategic guidance. Elizabeth had proven exceptionally capable as operational leader, bringing innovation and fresh perspective to the business while maintaining the foundational principles that had generated the original success. The business had evolved into something even more sophisticated than what Marcus had envisioned, a world-class breeding and training operation with a reputation that extended far beyond Texas. It was in the 15th year after the original 50-cent investment in redemption that something unexpected occurred. A letter arrived from a man named Thomas Blackwood, identifying himself as a journalist and author. Blackwood had been following the story of Webb Ashford horse operations for several years and, wanted to write a comprehensive book documenting the history of the business and the principles underlying its success. The proposal was extensive. Blackwood wanted to interview Marcus, Margaret, Harrison, Foster, Thomas, and other key figures in the business's development. He wanted access to records and correspondence. He wanted to trace the business from its 50-cent beginning to its current status as a recognized institution. "Why?" Marcus asked when Blackwood presented the proposal in person at the Clearwater Valley facility. "Why does this story matter enough to write a book about it?" "Because it's a story about seeing potential where others see only loss," Blackwood said. "It's a story about how systematic application of a simple principle can generate significant outcomes. It's a story that contradicts the narrative that success requires either inherited wealth or genius. You built something substantial by recognizing potential and having the patience to develop it. That's a story worth telling comprehensively." Marcus agreed to participate in the project, and over the next 2 years, Blackwood conducted extensive interviews and research. The resulting book, 5 Cents to Fortune, The Webb Ashford Story, was published to substantial critical acclaim. It received positive reviews in ranching publications, business journals, and even general interest publications. More importantly, it sparked renewed interest in the training programs at both Webb Ashford Institute and at Clearwater Valley. The book also had an unexpected effect on Marcus personally. Reading Blackwood's account of his own journey, Marcus was struck by how the story appeared when told comprehensively. The desperation of losing the family ranch, the audacity of purchasing a horse for 50 cents, the years of patient development, the expansion and formalization of the business, the return to foundational principles through refocusing operations. It was a narrative arc with genuine power, not because any individual element was exceptional, but because they accumulated into something significant. "You should be proud," Catherine said when she visited after reading the book. "Not just of what you've accomplished, but of how you've accomplished it. You didn't compromise your principles for the sake of expansion. You evolved them instead." "I haven't accomplished it alone," Marcus replied. "That's what the book doesn't fully capture. Every significant development involved other people. Margaret's expertise, Harrison's belief, Thomas's strategic thinking, Elizabeth's innovation. I provided one element, but I was never the sole driver. It was during the 17th year after purchasing Redemption that the original horse was finally retired from active breeding. The animal was approximately 30 years old, ancient for a horse, and had served as the foundation for multiple generations of exceptional animals. Redemption's offspring and descendants had become sought after throughout the ranching community, and the original horse's genetic contribution to Webb Ashford's reputation was immeasurable. The decision was made to retire Redemption to a sanctuary-style facility rather than allowing the horse to deteriorate. Marcus traveled to Dallas to personally oversee the transition, spending his final hours with the horse that had fundamentally changed his life. "You've had a remarkable existence," Marcus said, running his hand over Redemption's neck. "You went from being worth 50 cents to being worth thousands. You went from being hours from death to living to an age most horses never reach. You proved something that people needed to understand, that potential exists, even when it's hidden beneath damage and neglect." Redemption stood quietly, no longer recognizing Marcus as anything particular, but responding to the familiar voice with the calm of an animal that had known care and safety. The horse was released into a pasture with other retired animals, where it would spend its remaining years in comfort, unburdened by work, existing simply as a creature that had been given the opportunity to fully become what it was capable of being. Standing at the fence, watching Redemption move away, Marcus felt the weight of everything that had transpired since that day at the livestock auction in Clearwater Valley. The horse had been the catalyst, but the real story had always been about the principle that seeing potential and investing in its development generates returns that extend far beyond the initial investment. On his return to Clearwater Valley, Marcus made a decision regarding his own succession. His daughter Elizabeth was fully established as leader of Webb Ashford operations. But the training program at Clearwater Valley needed continuity. Marcus had worked with a young man named Michael Graves, someone who'd participated in the program's first cohort, who'd gone on to establish a successful operation, and who'd eventually chosen to return to Clearwater Valley to work as an associate instructor. "I want you to eventually take over complete operational leadership of this facility," Marcus told Graves. "Not immediately, but within the next few years. You understand the principles because you've lived them. You understand the teaching because you've been taught. You understand the students because you remember being in their position. You're ready." Graves accepted the responsibility with appropriate humility and gratitude. The transition would occur gradually, with Marcus maintaining an advisory role, while Graves assumed increasingly central responsibility. It was a replication of how Marcus himself had transitioned Webb Ashford to Elizabeth, not an abrupt handoff, but a gradual process of preparation and trust building. In the 18th year, at age 55, Marcus officially stepped away from regular operational involvement in the Clearwater Valley program. He maintained an office at the facility and remained available for consultation, but day-to-day teaching fell to Graves and an expanding staff of instructors who'd been trained in the program's methodology. With this transition complete, Marcus found himself in an unexpected position. He had successfully created something that could continue without his direct involvement. The business had evolved, expanded, and adapted while maintaining its foundational principles. The teaching program was established enough to persist independently. His work, in a sense, was complete, yet he didn't feel finished. Rather, he felt that he was entering a new phase 1, where his work would be reflective and mentoring rather than operational. He began writing, documenting his experiences and observations about what he'd learned from decades of working with animals and people. He corresponded with other operators and educators, sharing knowledge and learning from their experiences. He also spent time simply existing in Clearwater Valley, reconnecting with the community that had known him in his failure and watching it adjust to his success. He visited the cemetery where his father was buried regularly, not in mourning anymore, but in conversation, sharing with his father the fullness of what the principles Daniel had taught had ultimately generated. On what would later be identified as a turning point, Marcus received a visitor who'd traveled from back east specifically to see him. The visitor was a prominent businessman from Philadelphia who'd read Blackwood's book and wanted to discuss establishing Webb Ashford-style operations in the eastern states. "The model works," the businessman, named Samuel Richardson, explained. "I've studied it carefully. The principle of seeing potential where others see loss, the systematic application of that principle, the willingness to invest time in development, those aren't unique to ranching. They could be applied to many different enterprises." Marcus listened to Richardson's proposition with interest, but also with caution. The businesses Richardson was proposing, textile manufacturing, mining operations, agricultural development, were worlds away from horse breeding and ranching. "The principle might transfer," Marcus said carefully, "but the application would need to be fundamentally different. Each business operates according to its own logic. You can't just impose a ranching philosophy on textile manufacturing and expect it to work." "No," Richardson agreed. "But what if the core principle, seeing potential, investing in development, building something that lasts, is universal? What if that's applicable to human potential as much as animal potential?" The question lingered in Marcus's mind long after Richardson's departure. It suggested that the work he'd done wasn't ultimately about horses or ranching, but about something deeper, a philosophy of seeing and developing potential that might be applicable in fundamentally different contexts. As Marcus entered his 60s, he began what he thought of as the final chapter of his work. He accepted a handful of consulting projects where he worked with entrepreneurs and business leaders to think through how principles of identifying and developing potential might apply to their enterprises. He continued teaching at Clearwater Valley, though increasingly through mentorship and reflection rather than direct instruction. Most importantly, he spent time documenting his understanding of the principles that had guided his life's work. He wrote extensively about how to evaluate potential not just in animals, but in people, in situations, in businesses. He developed frameworks for thinking about what investments might generate lasting returns. He articulated the philosophy that had been implicit in his practices throughout his career. "What I've learned," he wrote in his unpublished reflections, "is that potential is everywhere. Most people dismiss it because it doesn't wear the appearance of immediate value. But value is sometimes hidden beneath damage or neglect or circumstance. The question is whether we have the courage to invest in seeing past the surface, the wisdom to understand what genuine potential looks like, and the patience to allow development to occur at its own pace." On his final visit to the cemetery where his father was buried, now at age 68, Marcus stood quietly for an extended period. He'd accomplished what his father had built, but in a different form. He'd honored the principles Daniel Webb had lived by, while extending them beyond the context of ranching into something with broader applicability. "I think I've understood what you were trying to teach me," Marcus said aloud to his father's grave. "It wasn't about ranching specifically. It was about seeing potential and having the faith that investment in its development will generate returns that extend far beyond what you initially imagined. I learned that lesson expensive, through loss. But I learned it, and I've tried to share it with others so they don't have to learn it that way." The wind moved through the cemetery, rustling the grass and the trees, and Marcus imagined it as his father's response, acknowledgement, and perhaps approval of how the principles had evolved and expanded across generations. As Marcus left the cemetery that final time, he understood that his work was truly complete now, not because there were no more challenges or opportunities, but because he had successfully transmitted what he'd learned to others who would carry it forward. His daughter leading Webb Ashford operations, Michael Graves directing the training program at Clearwater Valley, Samuel Richardson exploring how the principles might apply in different business contexts, dozens of former students operating successful enterprises based on what they'd learned. The 50-cent horse had been the beginning, but the true legacy was the understanding that had emerged from that initial investment that potential exists everywhere, that seeing it requires wisdom and courage, and that investing in its development generates returns that extend far beyond the initial investment. That was the real fortune that had been built from 5 cents. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.